At Texas A&M, we always start every class period by saying howdy, just to be extra Texas. So we're gonna try that tonight. So I say howdy, and you'll say howdy back. Can y'all do that? Here you go. Howdy! Howdy! Okay, good. Sadly, at Texas A&M, howdy now basically means like class is now starting. So that's what we're doing today. And students, thank you for being here. I know some of you are like, what I need at the end of a long day is a professor with PowerPoint slides. Like, I know you've already had a lot of that today, so we're going to try to go fast. I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end for discussion. And speaking of discussion, let's see if my thing will work. Yeah, it does. So I want y'all to discuss with the people around you. I'm going to give you a minute. You get 1 minute. I've got my timer going already. What are some ways in which you have been told that science and faith are in conflict? Discuss with the people around you. 1 minute. Go now. Go. Okay, your minute is up. Howdy. Hey, see how useful that is? All right, come back to me. All right, I want to hear from a couple of groups. All right, you back row Baptist back here, that little group right there. What did y'all talk about? Evolution. Evolution? Okay, all right, cool. How about one of these groups over? How about that group of students right there, Mr. Sir in the green? What did y'all talk about in your group?
Creation of the earth.
Okay, kind of related. Yeah, good. Any other things come up today? What about this group back here? Yeah. Yeah. Creation, evolution, things like that. Yes, sir.
When life begins.
When life begins. Oh, that's an interesting ethics and science coming together. Interesting. Good question. Yes, ma'am. Cecilia.
Wondering the physiological background behind miracles that are performed in the New Testament.
Yeah, we're going to talk about miracles, and it's like, well, what's the background there? Can I actually believe that that's true and still keep my science degree? Yeah, these are good. Well, today I don't know if I'm going to be able to go too deep on like some of the specific questions relating to the earth, the creation, history of life, origin of life, things like that. But I do want to try to speak very big picture. So basically when it comes to conflict between science and faith, you can have specifics about like, did this specific thing that I see in the Bible actually happen? Or you can have big picture disagreements. There are some people who are like, science tells us that miracles don't happen. That's a big picture disagreement. So I'm going to try to hit some of those big picture points today. So I'm going to try to address some of these myths. Myth number one is this one. You should only believe what you can scientifically prove. Anybody heard this before? Yep. So you'll hear this in various versions. Nick and I, whenever we talk about this, we always call this, you may hear this referred to as scientism. Scientism. Science is the road to truth. Other roads to truth, not really trustworthy. And this has a long history. I've gotten to do a little bit of reading from this philosopher, William Kingdon Clifford. He was famous for saying things like this. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So it's like if you believe it and you can't back it up, if you don't have evidence to prove that what you're saying is true, then you're doing something wrong. And he actually is kind of saying that you actually have a duty not to believe something unless you have evidence. So this idea of scientism, if I can kind of rephrase it, it would be that science is the only trustworthy means to objective truth. And people rarely say that out loud, but you'll sometimes hear people like draw a distinction between like, well, these are facts. And those are just opinions. Even when they say something like that, they're kind of buying into this scientism idea that there's this distinction. And so if scientism says science is the only way to know what's true, and science only studies the natural world, then that means the natural world is all you can know anything about. So I want you to see how this is different than like atheism. Atheism says there is no supernatural world. Scientism says you can't know anything about the natural world, right? You're quite likely to hear this from different places. This is associated with the famous philosopher David Hume, but you may even hear this on like modern day programs. Carl Sagan had this program called Cosmos, which Neil deGrasse Tyson resurrected here not too long ago. And so they would say, you can be religious, you can have that experience, you can do whatever you want, but it's not knowledge. You can't know anything. So that's scientism, and it really shows up in lots and lots of different places. Some of you who may be a little more perceptive, you may have picked up already like, I'm seeing a problem. So let's have a text message back and forth to David Hume. So here we're texting David Hume, and David says, only beliefs that can be proven through scientific experiments are trustworthy. There is an obvious question to ask David Hume. You should say, can you prove that statement through scientific experiments? And he says, I don't know. And so David Hume himself actually did notice, like, oh, this is kind of a problem. If I set up this high of a bar, like it's not knowledge unless I can find scientific evidence for it, then it doesn't count. That's a rule that fails itself. You see what I'm saying? It's like me saying, all sentences in English are a lie. Oh, wait, that sentence would then be a lie, which doesn't make any sense. So if you hear someone say something like this, it's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence, the obvious answer is like, give me some evidence that that's true. Like, you should respond and say like, I don't know about that, right? So, but still, even so, this idea of scientism is everywhere. So I had an experience. Here's my, my alma mater, my beautiful campus of Texas Tech. A classmate of mine, when I was an undergrad at Texas Tech, actually said, he said, Micah, science has proven that our minds are purely physical and there's no such thing as a soul. And I tried to ask him a little bit more about what he meant, and ultimately it turned out what he meant was that we used our material microscopes to look for an immaterial soul, and we didn't find it. So you see, he had this assumption of like, if my microscope can't find it, it doesn't exist. That's ultimately where scientism kind of leads you. It's saying like the microscope is the only tool you have. I hope you see what a problem that is. A microscope is really good at what microscopes are good at. But as soon as you assume, if I can't see it with the microscope, it doesn't exist, then you limit yourself in what you're able to actually go and know. There's an old illustration of the drunk who's lost his car keys, or lost his wallet, and the cop says, this is where you lost your wallet? And he says, well, no, I lost it in the park, but this is where the light is. If you say, I can only know things through science, then you just stay under that light and you don't look anywhere else, and you assume anything outside of that is unknowable. So you see how this isn't totally rational. It really limits what you can know. So let's try to think through, and I'll just ask you, what's an example of something that science cannot investigate? Somebody give me an example. I'll put you on the spot. What do you think? Love, good. What's another thing? What can science not investigate? The afterlife, good. What else? How about how you should act? Morality, yeah. So science, we use science to look at what does happen. Science describes what does happen. Here's what happened. But we can't really use science to tell what should happen. C.S. Lewis made this point in his book Miracles. Science can sometimes tell you a lot of different things. So for instance, like science can tell you like, all right, there's this big rock. And you might say, well, a scientist would say, Wile E. Coyote, you shouldn't do that. When we say should in that context, what we mean is like, it would be imprudent to do this. This might go horribly wrong. But what we can't tell is like, it is wrong to do that. You ought not to do that. It would be immoral for you to do that. We can't make statements like that. So that's the problem. So I want you to see that like, science, that when someone tells you you can only believe what you can scientifically prove, you believe in all kinds of things that you can't actually prove by science. This kind of gets to this point about love. Science is wonderful for studying the natural world. That's what your microscopes and telescopes are for. But it cannot say anything about ethics, meaning, beauty, or purpose. So this goes to your point about love. Like science can't say anything about that. It doesn't get into questions of ethics, meaning, or beauty. The great Oxford mathematician John Lennox has a great example of this. John Lennox, I got to interview him one time at A&M, and he gave this illustration. He said, if I ask you, why is the water boiling? Some of you in the room are mechanical engineers, and you say, okay, why is the water boiling? Well, if you put enough thermal energy, then the liquid water starts to go through a phase transition, and the thermodynamics say that you could give this long scientific explanation of why the water is boiling. But Lennox says like, yeah, but the reason the water is boiling is because I would like some tea. So you see the point is that like we can describe the water boiling from a scientific point of view, but if we say it's because John would like some tea, there has to be agency and purpose behind a statement like that. So science is good at what it's good at, but it can't get everything. It can't get everything. Okay, let's go on to myth number 2, and this gets more to our point tonight about miracles. You may have heard people say this, and they always have kind of a snooty tone when they talk about ancient people, so let's do it. Ancient people thought that miracles like a virgin birth were possible, but now, thanks to science, we know it can't happen. These ancient people who don't know anything. So I want you, that attitude of chronological snobbery can show up sometimes where we think, I know a lot. Ancient people didn't know very much. So I want you to now imagine we go back and tell Joseph, you know that virgin births are impossible, right? You know what he would say? He'd say, I know. I got it. And you'd be like, what do you mean you already got it? You thought, what's going on? So let's see if we can figure out why we have a kind of a disconnect with Joseph. So the reason that we kind of get into this mode of thinking in terms of scientism really has to do with the history of science during the Enlightenment. Who's this guy? Isaac Newton. He wrote the Principia Mathematica, combining calculus and Latin, your two least favorite subjects. And even though you may say, like, I don't want to read about math in Latin, Newton's work was a huge influence on the scientists of his time because people were like, oh, amazing, Newton's laws of motion. With these equations, you can predict the motion and the behavior of everything. Everything. You could say how the baseball is going to move. You could say how the rockets are going to move. You could tell how the planets are going to move. Then so those equations can predict how everything is going to act. And once you say everything, you're like, oh, I mean everything. And so people got into the idea of like Newton's laws show how the world is a big mechanism and it all fits together. And they would talk about the world almost as if it was like a clock, like a giant clock like so. And the French would talk about la machine du monde, the machine of the world. And so they would say, yeah, everything fits together. And if you know where things are now, you use Newton's equation and you can predict where it's going to be tomorrow. It all works perfectly like clockwork. And so there's this famous quote from Laplace. Laplace was a mathematician during the Napoleonic era, and he wrote this big book of mathematics and physics. And Napoleon, he's like, here, my liege. Napoleon, the emperor, flips through the book, and he's like, that's great, Laplace. And he told Laplace, I don't see God anywhere in your book. And Laplace said, in French, he said, sire, I have no need of that hypothesis. Now, with a quote like that, you might think Laplace was an atheist, saying God doesn't exist. But he actually wasn't. It was more so that the coin of the realm at that time, the late 1700s, early 1800s, they would say, yeah, maybe there's a God. Maybe God took that clock and wound it up and then let it go. And God doesn't interfere. He doesn't stick his fingers in. What would you call that view? Someone said it? Deism. Yes, deism. So that's what I think that's the label that I think belongs here. So that hypothesis, he says, maybe God exists, but he doesn't intervene. He doesn't stick his fingers in. We would call that deism. And so they became opposed to the idea of miracles because that would represent like the clock's moving along and then God pokes his finger in and changes something. And they're like, well, we can't do that. That messes up science. That messes up science. The whole point of Newton's equations are that you can use science and predict what's going to happen tomorrow. I can't have God poking his fingers in. So the deist would say God gets it all started and then walks away and lets it go. So that's deism. That's the idea. And so if you're a deist, you don't believe in miracles. You say science works, science predicts what's going to happen, no miracles allowed on philosophical grounds. If we allowed for the possibility of miracles, it would actually mess up our ability to do science because we can't make predictions anymore. So they would say we have the natural world, natural science says here's what happens, and science tells you that virgin births don't happen, that resurrections don't happen, and that's it. Science tells us what's going to happen, and so miracles don't happen. So C.S. Lewis wrote this great book called Miracles, and the key point, I think this gets back to what Joseph was thinking about. Lewis tells us that we shouldn't ever hear something like science says miracles are impossible. Science deals with the natural world, but a miracle involves more than the supernatural. More than the natural, involves the supernatural. And so Lewis gave this great illustration. Students, I first read this illustration from Lewis when I was like 20, and I still remember it all these years later, so hopefully you'll remember it as well. Lewis talked about playing billiards. Billiards is kind of like playing pool, but somehow more boring. But billiards is great for like, let's take Newton's equations of motion for a ride. So I have the cue ball, and I'm going to strike the cue ball, pow, I'm going to hit it with a certain force at a certain angle. And then you go and you do your calculations, and you say, all right, if I strike the cue ball with a certain force at a certain angle, then it was going to go off the wall, it's going to hit the other ball, and it's going to go in the pocket. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Where'd Mark go, right? It's going to happen. Newton's equations say so. So Mark and I are going to do the experiment. We have the billiards table. Yes, we did the calculations. We know it's going to happen. It's going to happen for sure. And then, so I get ready, and we said, science says this ball is going to go in the pocket. All right? Here we go, Isaac Newton. And I hit the cue ball, and then Mark grabs the cue ball right after I hit it. So we have a problem. Science said the ball would go in the pocket, and it didn't. So did we disprove science? Engineers, did we disprove science? No. Some of you engineers may have developed a good habit that when you do a physics problem like that, you always have this one little thing you do, which is you draw a little dotted line around the table and say, here's my system. And you assume that there's nothing outside the system that interferes, right? So he said, assuming this is my system and nothing outside the system interferes, the ball will go in the pocket. And it just so happens that that assumption was not true because Mark decided to grab the ball. And so if you say, what is a miracle? A miracle is not natural law being violated. Mark didn't violate natural law. He reached in from outside the table and changed something. And that is what a miracle is. It is God reaching from outside the table and changing something. And just like Mark didn't actually violate the laws of physics, when God does a miracle, it also does not violate the laws of physics. And so you can see that once you admit the possibility of a God, then miracles become possible. So, for instance, you'll see arguments that are like this. They'll say, hey, natural forces tell me that a dead person is not going to come back to life. Science says so. All right, look at premise 1. Is that true? I think premise 1 is true. Science says natural forces can't cause a dead person to come back to life. But then they always skip premise 2. They never tell you this, but they assume it. They assume there are only natural forces. Conclusion, a dead person cannot be resurrected. If you allow for the possibility that there is a God in the universe, then premise 2 is false, right? It's possible that our assumption that we have a closed system might be wrong and that God could reach in and cause someone to rise from the dead. So that's why this argument is unsuccessful. And you'll see this all over the place, is that people assume premise 2 and then act like they prove that miracles are impossible. This happens all the time. I'll give you an example. This is from an atheist at a recent conference. He said, well, modern cell biology has radically undermined the credibility of the virgin birth because it would require God's making a Y chromosome out of nothing in Mary's oven. How ridiculous. And if you believe in God, does this bother you? No. It's like, of course God can do that. So this isn't a very successful argument. It doesn't really bother you. So the real reason people are liable to say there are only natural forces is either they don't believe that God exists, or they think in order to be a scientist, I have to assume that God is not going to reach onto the table. The reason they might assume that is because they think, oh gosh, like I don't want all my experiments to go horribly wrong, like what happens to Bunsen Honeydew and Beaker here. You can imagine, they might think, if I'm a scientist and I believe that God exists and that God might reach onto the table and mess up my experiment, then my scientific career is over. Because I might think that like God's going to reach in and mess up my experiment tomorrow and cause one of my socks to disappear in the dryer tomorrow night. And like, you see what I'm saying? It's this possibility of a capricious trickster God who would reach in and change your experiment. So this is where Christians actually do have an answer. We say, yes, God has the ability to reach into the natural world and do a miracle, but He's not going to do so capriciously. He's not going to mess up your experiment for fun. Instead, Christians view miracles as happening within a religious context. Right? Miracles always happen in a religious context. I'll give you an example. When Jesus is teaching to a bunch of people, and then a paralytic is brought to him. They actually bring a paralytic to him through the ceiling because of crowd control. And so Jesus says to this paralytic, your sins are forgiven. And then some of the people around him are like, I don't know about that. And then Jesus says, which is easier, to say to someone, your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority, I say to you, get up and walk. And He heals this paralytic. So what that tells you is everybody's not just like, oh, great, he can walk, that's good for him. They say like, oh, this says something about who Jesus is. The point of the miracle is not merely to make that person's life easier. The point of the miracle is to make a larger religious point about who Jesus is. Miracles are not capricious. They don't happen for no reason. They have a religious purpose. That's why you as a scientist can go to your lab, do experiments, and be confident that God's not going to mess with your experiment for fun. Does that make sense? So that's how you can believe that miracles are possible, yes, and I'm still a scientist at the same time, because miracles don't happen randomly. Okay, so I hope we've addressed that miracles thing. So miracles are naturally impossible, but we don't make the claim that miracles are natural. We say they're supernatural. So when you tell Joseph, like, Joseph, you know that a virgin birth is impossible, he would say, I know that science says a virgin birth is naturally impossible, but I don't think this is a natural situation. I think there's something supernatural involved here. That's what Joseph would say, and he'd be right. All right, myth number 3. A lot of Christians are anti-science. That's actually true. There may be a lot of Christians who are anti-science, and that's especially here in the U.S. There's a lot of sociological reasons for that. So you do have to be kind of careful about that. And so anyway, as I will tell you, for those of you who are Christians, be careful about trying to speak out against the scientific establishment. Like, keep your powder dry for when it really matters, because even going back to Augustine, the early church fathers would say, if Christians speak on a topic where we're kind of ignorant, we may accidentally put barriers to the gospel in there for no good reason. So please proceed with caution. Okay, now we've addressed these different myths, I want to go on and try to ask you some questions. One is, can science tell us about the existence of the supernatural? Some of us talked about apologetics before. We talked about evolution and creation and like where did life come from, things like this. We need to proceed with caution because we already told you science studies the natural world. Science doesn't study the supernatural world. So this question can be handled poorly. I will give you an example. Who's this guy on the right?
Bill O'Reilly.
That's Bill O'Reilly. So Bill O'Reilly had this atheist, whose name I can't remember, on his show, and Bill O'Reilly was trying to give this atheist a hard time. And so he tried to think of what's something that like the atheist cannot explain except by appealing to God. And of all the things he could have picked, Bill O'Reilly said, so the tides go in, the tides go out, you can't explain that. And sadly, this atheist also did not know what causes the tides. And he was like, well, I can't explain it now, but I'm sure there is a scientific explanation. So you don't, and you can just imagine like the 13-year-olds at home yelling at their TV, like, it's the moon. The gravitational effect of the moon on the earth, on the water of the earth is what causes the tides. And so anyway, it was really frustrating for anybody to watch that both of these people didn't know what caused the tides. And it caused the creation of memes like this one. Bread goes in, toast comes out. You can't explain that. So this is what I would call God of the gaps arguments. Like, here's a gap in our understanding. I don't understand how bread becomes toast. Therefore, God does it. You know, that sort of thing. Try not to do that. Let's in general try not to appeal to gaps in our understanding because, as you might imagine, as we get more scientific understanding, perhaps those gaps get smaller. I got to spend some quality time with Richard Dawkins a few months ago, and his belief is that all arguments for the existence of God or the existence of the supernatural are basically like this, that we have a gap, we explain it with God, and then science helps to fill the gap eventually. That's what his perspective is, and it's partially informed by comments like this. He's seen these kind of God of the gaps arguments in the past. So I guess I'll give you a different perspective. Instead of saying science can prove God, I guess I would say science can't study the supernatural, so science can't prove God. But it can kind of make you suspicious, and I'll give you a few examples. One of the examples is that, and I heard some people talk about this earlier, that there used to be a debate about whether our physical universe began at some point in the past. Thomas Aquinas thought, like, oh, well, if our universe began at some point in the past, that kind of points to the capital G word, so that would look pretty suspicious. And then as Big Bang cosmology began to appear, people began to realize, like, oh, wait, it really looks like our physical space-time universe began at some point in the past. So if it began, then where did it come from? Did it pop into existence out of nothing? That's hard to understand. And so this atheist physicist named Lawrence Krauss, who's now at Arizona State, he actually wrote this book called A Universe from Nothing, afterward by Richard Dawkins. And Krauss basically tries to argue, like, wait. So if you have an energy field and it has an average energy of 0, you can have quantum fluctuations, and from that you can get a universe. And everyone who read the book was like, wait a minute, that's not nothing. If you think the universe can come from nothing, you have to start with nothing. Nothing, actual nothing. And so basically the entire book was flawed because he was like, well, we'll start with kind of nothing, and then we'll try to see if a universe could come from there. But if you genuinely start with nothing, it's very difficult to explain where the universe could have come from. If there's something outside, some cause outside the universe, science can't probe it, but that does sound kind of suspicious. Another case where science can make you kind of suspicious, and I think Dr. Mike Strauss from OU spoke on this here at Embry-Riddle a few years ago, is what we call the fine-tuning problem. Dawkins told me he thought this was the most interesting argument for the existence of God. And it's the idea that if you take all the physical parameters like the mass of the electron, speed of light, the gravitational constant, like those numbers didn't have to be what they are. So you could like dial them and make them different. And so physicists can do simulations of what kind of a universe we would get if you start messing with those numbers. And it turns out, if you start messing with some of these numbers, you start to have like real problems. Like if you're down in this part of the map, you can't get carbon or any kind of heavier elements. If you're up here, it's actually impossible to have chemical reactions. Over here, you can't even get hydrogen. And there's this narrow little slit in here where you get a universe like ours that can have complex chemistry and actually have life. And if you mess with any of the constants, then you fall off into one of these other kind of zones. And it turns out there are many graphs like this, where if you take the physical constants, you mess with them a little bit, you get a universe that's like all hydrogen or all helium or otherwise boring and unable to support life. And so, I mean, if it turns out those constants, they didn't have to be what they are, but they are perfectly fine-tuned to allow us to be here, that should make you suspicious. If you're wondering what would an atheist make of that, usually the answer is like, well, maybe there's an infinite number of universes and we're in the lucky one. That's possible. The other possibility is that when you see fine-tuning, it's possible that someone fine-tuned it. So these don't prove God, but they at least make you suspicious and make you think. I want to end on this question, which is what has been helpful to me in terms of thinking about whether there is more than just atoms and energy in the universe, whether there's anything supernatural. The one thing that was really helpful to me is to ponder this particular question, which is our minds. Our minds. How do our minds work? Why do they work? How are our minds able to understand the universe in the first place? So I'll be a little bit autobiographical. In early 2003, I was a graduate student at MIT, and any of you who've lived in Boston know that the first winter you spend in Boston is going to be long and dark and cold, and you're not going to be ready for it. And so during that first long, cold, dark winter, I began to wonder about some of my more materialist friends, and I thought, well, what if they're right? What if there is no supernatural? If there's no supernatural, then like there's no God, there's no afterlife, and when you die, like boom, the lights go out and you stop existing. It's not like you're asleep, it's like you stop existing. And not only do you stop existing, but eventually the consequences are not only that you will be snuffed out, but that everything you care about, the entire universe will eventually undergo heat death, and anything that you value or think is good will go away. There's no purpose, no ethics, everything will come to nothing, and that's the way the universe is. That's the consequence if the materialists are right and we live in a universe that's full of matter and energy, and that's it. It's pretty depressing. And I thought that was pretty depressing, and I thought, oh, I don't want that to be true. And I thought, oh man, what if I'm a Christian, so what if I only believe in Christianity because I want it to be true? And I got super skeptical with myself, like maybe I just believe this because I want it to be true. And anyway, I really struggled and I lost a lot of sleep, because if this is true, that we're all just atoms and energy and that's it, not only is it depressing, but there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing you can do about it. So other than just like lose sleep and experience that existential angst. So I really struggled with that. It was a big problem. No ethics, no purpose, no meaning. So and a few things kind of brought me out of this period of depression and suffering that I had. One thing, I started reading a lot of J.R.R. Tolkien, and you might think that doesn't matter, but it actually does matter. As spring began to happen, that spring of 2003, and the sun came out again and the plants came out again, and I would walk by the Charles River, I began to think like, well, if we did live in an accidental universe that's just a meaningless conglomeration of atoms, it's kind of hard to explain the beauty that we see. I think it would be a lot more gray and a lot more boring, and when I look at the world, I see something that has narrative, that has story. It's a lot more like Tolkien stories than it is like this gray, drab, boring world that one might expect on a materialist view. And so I thought, like, that implies that we are living in a narrative with an author. So that helped to bring me out of it. The idea that beauty is real, and I can't just dismiss beauty, I think is biblical. And the Psalms, the psalmist says, "One thing I've asked the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." The idea that we live in a world devoid of beauty, and beauty is just something we make up, I couldn't quite square myself with that. But the other thing that brought me out of that period of prolonged skepticism is this question. And this is what I'll leave you with. We'll spend some time thinking through this question. If materialism, that's the idea that there's only matter and energy in the world, that's it. If materialism is true, then what does that mean about my mind? It actually means that I don't have a mind. I don't have a mind, I just have a brain, and that's it. Like you say, it's just a biochemical brain, that's it. And if I think that I'm a rational person, actually all those things that I think are rational are just really biochemistry, and that's it. It's just a biochemical reaction. And not only my sense of rationality, but my sense of first-person conscious experience. So right now, I'll go ahead and tell you, I am currently experiencing life from my first-person perspective, and I think that you are too, right? You see things from behind your eyes. That's what we mean by consciousness, that you have a first-person subjective experience, and materialism would say that that is actually just biochemistry as well. And it turns out that has some problems. I'll try to explain why. Here's the famous Francis Crick, of Crick and Watson fame. And Crick says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So this is basically what I said on the prior slide. If materialism is true, you are just biochemistry. And that's what Crick is saying. We would call this reductionism. Crick looks at you and says, you are only, there's nothing more to you than biochemistry, and that's it. And what I hope you see the problem is that if we rephrase this to where Crick is talking about himself, now he says, my joys and my sorrows, my memories, my ambitions, my sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And if someone says that to you, then you should say, then why should I listen to you? You're just a biochemical experiment. Why should I listen to you? You're not even rational. And if you're wondering, if you think that I'm exaggerating this problem of like, if we're just biochemistry, then that undermines rationality. Here's a remarkable quote. I want you to read this quote closely with me. The quote is this: with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? This quote, believe it or not, is from Charles Darwin. He's saying, if that's all we are, then why are we listening to ourselves? And I remember that spring of 2003, late night, having that existential angst and thinking like, oh, what if there's nothing more to me than atoms? And then I thought like, if that's true, then why am I listening to myself? I had this exact thought. So I want you to see what the consequences of reductionism are, that it reduces us to being sub-rational. And I'll let you see how that actually plays out in action. So this is a quote from Nicholas Wade in the New York Times. He says, well, religion has the hallmarks of an evolved behavior, meaning that it exists because it was favored by natural selection. It was universal because it's wired into our neural circuitry. So you can imagine now having a text message thread with Nicholas. He says, oh, you have religious beliefs because it's wired into your neural circuitry. And you say, did you make that statement because it's wired into your neural circuitry? And Nicholas would have to say, I don't know. So you see the problem. If someone says, you only believe this because you're biochemically wired to do that, anyone who says that has to be willing to turn the knife on themselves and say, I only believe what I believe because it's biochemically wired into my circuitry. If you explain rationality away on the basis of materialism, then you're explaining yourself away. Do you see the problem? It is self-defeating. It's self-undercutting to say that we are not rational people. If you undercut rationality, then you should stop listening to yourself. So that's the rationality problem. I also want to talk to you about the consciousness problem. Anybody recognize this little beast? What is that? What is that thing? A Tamagotchi. So I thought Tamagotchis were only popular in the 90s. Apparently, y'all still know what they are? Okay, what is a Tamagotchi? Somebody tell me. Yeah, it's a little electronic pet. And if you neglect it, what happens? Yeah, well, it will eventually die. On the way to dying, it will cry. It'll be like, meh, and say like, feed me, right? So it's this thing, you're supposed to like take care of it or whatever. And I'll tell you, like I had a friend in back in the 90s, and he was this kind of a cruel person. He would have a Tamagotchi, and he would purposefully neglect his Tamagotchi and let it starve to death, and ignore its little pitiful cries, me, feed me, and he would be like, ha, 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 and eventually his Tamagotchi would die. So I thought, like, this person is going to be in prison someday, right? So this is a messed up person. Now, if my memory serves correctly, the same person would also pull a similar trick. Who's that? This is old school, 1980s Mario. And so the same friend figured out there was a trick, like a little code you could cheat, and give Mario like 99 lives. So what he would do is he would give Mario 99 lives and then leave the game controller on and put tape on the little right-hand part of the joystick so that Mario would move right to his death over and over and over again in some kind of Mario purgatory, dying repeatedly. Again, this is a disturbed individual. Did y'all agree? Yes, okay. Here's the question. Do you actually feel bad for the Tamagotchi? Do you actually feel bad for Mario? You don't feel bad for them because they do not feel pain like you do. You feel pain. If you were starved, you would actually feel pain. You would have a first-person subjective conscious experience of pain, whereas the Tamagotchi is a little computer that's programmed, when neglected, to make a noise, and that's it. Do you all agree? So the problem is that if materialism is true and you are merely a biochemical meat computer, it is actually very difficult to explain what the difference is between you and the Tamagotchi. You're just a meat computer. You're programmed to give little responses in response to certain stimuli. But the Tamagotchi and the laptop and Mario, they don't have an inner thought life. It's just a computer, and so are you. And at this point, you should say, but that's not true. I know that I have a conscious experience. That is right. So if someone tells you you're not actually conscious, you should feel free to not listen to that person. Okay? And if you think I'm joking, look at this. This is a quote this is a headline, a Steven Pinker article from Time magazine. It says, "The brain, the mystery of consciousness. You exist, right? Prove it. How 100 billion jabbering neurons create the knowledge or illusion that you're here." Can you imagine Rene Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am? No, you're not. You don't exist. In fact, I'm not even sure who I'm telling. Do you see what I'm saying? If materialism points someone to say that you don't exist, then you know something's wrong with materialism, if it points you in that direction. I'll give you another example. You'll tell me, what color is that? What color is that? Okay, I agree, red and green. But when there's a certain redness that I see out of my eyeball, and I've always seen red looking that way. And you may have a certain shade that you see as red, that you see out of your eyeball, but it's actually possible that what you perceive as red and what I perceive as red aren't actually the same. And here's the unbelievable thing. There is no way to check. There is no way to check, and we call that qualia. It's the subjective experience of what red looks like. And there's no way to know. There's no scientific experiment. There's nothing we can do to see if it's different. I mean, Nick and I have both been raised to know that that's red, but Nick might see red differently than I do, and I would never know. So the fact that there's something in our minds that science cannot probe should bother you if you're a materialist. And so amazingly, that has actually caused some people to say, consciousness doesn't exist. Qualia don't exist. I think it can best be summarized by this little cartoon. This is of the famous materialist Daniel Dennett. He's written a love poem, and he says, "Roses are red, violets are blue, but qualia don't exist, and neither do you." What this shows you is that if you believe in materialism and you really stick to it, you'll conclude that consciousness isn't real and you are not real. You're just a biochemical soup. I don't know about y'all, but I can't go there. If someone tells me you have to believe something that I know to be false, then I can't go there. So I want you to end with this, and if you remember any one slide, I want you to remember this one. There are going to be moments where someone says, I want you to give me evidence. I want you to give me evidence that there is something in this world beyond just atoms and energy. Give me any evidence that there's anything beyond the natural world. It actually turns out that you have beautiful evidence that there's something beyond the natural world because you have a mind that is rational, conscious, and moral. If your rationality is real, then you are more than just material. If you have a subjective, conscious self, you are more than material. And if morality is real, more than just biochemistry, more than just human convention, but a real feature of the universe about how we should and should not live, then those are all pieces of evidence that there is more to this world than just atoms. So if you have those moments, those existential, doubting, angsty moments like what I did when I was a grad student, I want you to remember this. There is evidence. There is evidence that there's more to this world than just atoms, and much of it is revealed in your mind. And I, as a Christian, I actually believe that this is part of what is meant by the fact that we are created in God's image. The Bible says God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. So if you say, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? It means a lot of things, including your dignity, your value, and I think it includes these things. Like God, we have a sense of rationality, first-person consciousness, and a sense of right and wrong. So I'll end on this point. I think, unlike the stereotype that science and faith are diametrically opposed, I actually think that Christianity has a lot to offer to the scientific mind. So because if you're a scientist, you have to make certain assumptions about the world. You have to believe that when we sense something and take data, that's reliable. You have to believe and assume that the universe is understandable and orderly and is going to follow regular laws and be predictable and act the same tomorrow as it did yesterday. And that the laws of physics are the same on Mars as they are on here. Yeah, right? Those kind of assumptions you have to make. And you have to assume that your mind is reliable, that your mind can figure out the way that the universe is made. And if you're a materialist, I don't really know why you get to make those assumptions, especially the last one. How do you know your mind is reliable? It's just biochemistry, a biochemical accident that evolved to survive and reproduce, and that's it. So this last one is really up for grabs. And even the second one about why is the universe understandable and orderly, I don't really know why. And even the great Albert Einstein remarked, he said, the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. The fact that we can use our minds to understand the way the world out there works is amazing. We take it for granted now, but this is not something we should take for granted. People didn't always believe this. In fact, the early scientists were almost all Christians, and they answered these assumptions by saying, aha, the universe is understandable and orderly because God made the universe. My mind is reliable because God made my mind. Not only that, God actually made my mind with the intent that I would go out and understand the universe. I want you to think about what that means. Instead of thinking like, well, Christians and scientists hate each other, Christians actually have a religious motivation to go out and do science. The Christian says, God made the universe, God made my mind, God made the laws of physics, and He wants me to use my mind to understand how the laws of physics work. Because if I understand how it works, then I understand something about how He made the universe and I can glorify Him. And if you think I'm making that up, you should see the quotes from people like Kepler and Pascal. I'll leave you with this quote from Kepler. He says, these laws of nature, these physical laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after His own image so that we could share in His own thoughts. What that means is for a student here at Embry-Riddle who makes a discovery and they're the first human to understand something, it means you're the first human to understand that aspect of physical law since God. And now you've understood like, oh, that's awesome. I see how God put the world together. Students, I want you to imagine that you walk into someone's room and they've amassed like this huge set of amazing inventions and designs. And you go into one of your labs and you look at the way someone designed something and you say, oh, I see what you did there. That's cool. That is basically what science is. As we look at what God has made and we say, oh, I see what you did there. That's awesome. And that statement, I see what you did there, that's awesome, is how we worship, that we can glorify God. So instead of having this stereotype in your mind of science and faith being diametrically opposed, is that faith provides the motivation and undergirds the assumptions that we need in order to get science moving. So I want you to really think of science and faith as coming together and not diametrically opposed in that way. Okay, with that, I will close. Thank you so much.